For decades, thousands of California prisoners vanished into a place the public was never meant to see, a concrete world of silence called the Security Housing Unit at Pelican Bay. In 2011, those invisible men broke that silence with an act of desperation that shook the prison system and forced California to confront the way it uses solitary confinement. This is the true story of how hunger strikes, lawsuits, and public pressure changed a system once thought untouchable. When Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989, it was designed to be California's highest security facility, located on an isolated stretch of the North Coast near Crescent City. At the heart of the complex was the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, a sprawling X-shaped block of windowless concrete pods built to hold more than 1,000 prisoners in near-total isolation. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, facility data, the SHU's original purpose was to control prisoners identified as gang leaders or disruptive inmates, separating them from the general population. Cells in the SHU measured about 8 by 10 feet, with a concrete bunk, stainless steel toilet, and a small slot in the door for meals. Prisoners typically spent 22.5 to 24 hours a day alone, with no programming and very limited visits. Their yard was a small, high-walled exercise pen known to prisoners as the Dog Run, an area just large enough to pace or do push-ups under a patch of open sky. These conditions were documented in multiple reports, including Madrid v. Gomez, ND Cal's 1995, where a federal judge described the SHU as harsh and psychologically debilitating for mentally ill inmates. By the late 2000s, more than 1,000 men were housed in Pelican Bay's SHU under California's gang validation policy. Under that policy, a prisoner could be assigned to indefinite solitary confinement if affiliated, as determined, often through confidential informants, tattoos, or possession of certain artwork, that he was affiliated with a prison gang. Once validated, release from the SHU typically required debriefing, meaning giving information about gang activity, a process many prisoners saw as dangerous or impossible. As a result, some men spent 10, 20, or even more than 30 years in isolation without a new disciplinary infraction. Center for Constitutional Rights, 2012. Psychologists and human rights groups had warned for years about the effects of such long-term isolation. Research cited by the American Friends Service Committee and Amnesty International documented sleep problems, hallucinations, depression, and suicidal thoughts among SHU prisoners. In 2011, Amnesty called Pelican Bay's SHU conditions cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and urged California to impose strict time limits on solitary confinement. But at the time, those calls seemed to have little effect on policy. The CDCR maintained that the SHU was essential for controlling violence and protecting staff and other inmates. In official statements, the department argued that only the most dangerous and disruptive prisoners were sent there and that the conditions met constitutional standards. Public attention to solitary confinement remained minimal until the prisoners themselves decided to act. On July 1, 2011, more than 1,000 inmates at Pelican Bay and thousands more across California launched a coordinated hunger strike. Their demands included an end to indefinite SHU terms, fairer gang validation reviews, more access to educational programs and phone calls, better food, and improved medical care. According to the Center for Constitutional Rights, this was one of the largest prisoner hunger strikes in U.S. history at the time. It marked the beginning of a 4-year campaign that would fundamentally change solitary confinement in California. The July 2011 hunger strike was unprecedented in scale. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's own figures reported at the time, more than 6,600 inmates in 13 state prisons initially joined the action in solidarity with Pelican Bay SHU prisoners. CDCR press release, July 2011. Inside Pelican Bay, leaders of rival gangs had agreed to a temporary truce so that the strike could be coordinated. Inmates refused food for 3 weeks, surviving on liquids while presenting a 5-point list of demands that included 1. An end to group punishment, 2. Fairer gang validation and debriefing procedures, 3. Compliance with the 2006 Commission on Safety and Abuse in America's Prisons recommendations, 4. Adequate food, and 5. constructive programming and privileges comparable to other prisons. The strike's organizers, men who had spent decades in windowless cells, wrote open letters that were circulated by family members and prisoner rights groups. In one widely published statement, Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition 2011, they said, "We are human beings. We have been indefinitely warehoused and tortured. We will no longer allow this to continue." For many Californians who had never thought about life inside a SHU, the letters offered a rare first-person glimpse of conditions otherwise hidden from public view. After 3 weeks, CDCR officials promised to review the gang validation and SHU policies, and most prisoners suspended the strike. But when little seemed to change, a second hunger strike erupted in September 2011, this time involving more than 11,000 prisoners statewide. Los Angeles Times, September 30, 2011. By then, public awareness had grown. Editorials appeared in major newspapers questioning the use of indefinite solitary confinement. State legislators began asking for briefings. Amnesty International sent observers to California. For the first time, the conditions inside Pelican Bay's SHU were being debated on the floor of the state capitol. Still, progress was slow. CDCR implemented a pilot step-down program meant to offer a pathway out of the SHU for some prisoners, but critics said it remained arbitrary and tied to debriefing. Inmates and advocates argued that only a lawsuit could force real change. In May 2012, with legal help from the Center for Constitutional Rights, the group of Pelican Bay prisoners who had led the strikes filed a federal class action lawsuit, Ashker v. Brown, originally Ashker v. Governor of California. The suit challenged indefinite SHU confinement on due process and Eighth Amendment grounds, claiming it caused grave harm and lacked meaningful review. While the case moved through court, tensions built inside the prisons. In July 2013, prisoners launched what became the largest hunger strike in California history. According to CDCR data and news reports, CBS News, July 2013, at its peak, more than 30,000 inmates in 2/3 of the state's prisons were refusing meals. Many lost 20 to 30 pounds. Family members held vigils outside the gates. State officials responded by seeking court orders to allow force feeding if necessary to prevent deaths. Photographs of gaunt prisoners and letters from mothers to lawmakers appeared on evening news broadcasts and in national newspapers. The 2013 strike lasted 60 days. Under mounting pressure, state legislators convened hearings on solitary confinement. The Ashker lawsuit gained momentum, with federal judge Claudia Wilkin allowing the case to proceed as a class action, representing all Pelican Bay SHU prisoners held more than 10 years. By late 2014, settlement talks were underway. The story that had begun in secret concrete cells was now being debated in public, in the legislature, the courts, and the press. For many observers, the hunger strikes represented a turning point. They demonstrated that even the most isolated prisoners could organize non-violently across racial and gang lines, and that public opinion could shift when conditions were exposed. For the prisoners themselves, it was an act of last resort, a gamble that risking their health and lives might finally end the endless cycle of solitary confinement. By 2015, 4 years after the first hunger strike, the fight over Pelican Bay's security housing unit had moved decisively into federal court. On September 1st of that year, after extensive negotiations, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, agreed to a landmark settlement in Ashker v. Governor of California, Center for Constitutional Rights, press release, September 2015. Under the agreement, CDCR would no longer keep prisoners in indefinite solitary confinement solely on the basis of gang validation, the very policy that had defined the SHU for more than 2 decades. Instead, prisoners could only be placed in the SHU for a fixed term following a serious disciplinary violation, and would receive periodic reviews to determine whether continued segregation was necessary. The settlement also created a new 2-year step-down program for prisoners who had already spent more than 10 years in the SHU. Those men would be transferred to less restrictive housing or directly into general population if they successfully completed each step without new serious infractions. This marked the first time California committed in writing to a time-limited path out of its most restrictive units. At the time of the agreement, More than 500 Pelican Bay prisoners had been held in the SHU for 10 years or longer, and 78 had been there for more than 20 years, CDCR data cited by CCR. Many of these men had been deemed gang affiliates, but had no recent discipline, RE violations. Within months of the settlement, hundreds were moved out of the SHU into general population or other high-security yards with more privileges. By 2016, the population of Pelican Bay's SHU dropped from more than 1,100 to fewer than 400. Statewide, the number of prisoners in indeterminate solitary confinement fell by over 80%, Los Angeles Times, December 2016. For prisoners who had spent decades in windowless cells, the transfers were dramatic. Some saw open yard space for the first time in years. Others were able to make phone calls to family members or participate in rehabilitative programs long denied to them. In interviews with the press, several described their first contact visits in decades, hugging their children or grandchildren for the first time. CBS News, 2016. Advocates hailed the settlement as a historic victory and a model for other states. The Center for Constitutional Rights called it the end of indefinite solitary confinement in California, and noted that it had been achieved not only through litigation, but through the coordinated action of prisoners themselves. Prisoner rights groups across the country cited Ashker as evidence that reform was possible even in the most entrenched systems. CDCR officials, for their part, defended the agreement as a balanced approach that maintained security while addressing concerns about long-term isolation. In public statements, the department emphasized that prisoners who committed new serious violations could still be placed in segregated housing, but with clearer time limits and regular review. Some correctional officers' unions expressed caution, warning that releasing longtime SHU inmates into general population might increase violence. Yet initial CDCR data showed no immediate statewide surge in assaults following the transfers, a fact later cited by reformers as proof that the old PO's LICE had been overly punitive rather than strictly necessary for safety. The settlement also had ripple effects beyond California. By 2016 and 2017, states such as Colorado, New Jersey, and North Dakota enacted laws or policies limiting the duration or conditions of solitary confinement, often citing Pelican Bay and Ashker as part of the national conversation. Colorado, HB 19 to 1269. New Jersey Isolated Confinement Restriction Act, 2019. Journalists began referring to Pelican Bay's SHU as a case study in how sustained pressure and litigation could transform one of the harshest prison systems in the country. Still, even as the SHU population dropped sharply, many advocates warned that the fight was not over. California continued to operate restricted housing units, and some prisoners remained in near-solitary conditions under different labels. This is a milestone, not an endpoint, one CCR attorney said in 2016. We have to keep monitoring how the settlement is implemented and whether it truly ends prolonged isolation. CCR, 2016. After the settlement took effect, Pelican Bay began converting parts of its SHU into a general population plus unit with small group yards, classes, and more visiting access. Formerly isolated men now shared spaces with others for the first time in decades. CDCR reported that many adjusted without major incident, though psychologists noted high levels of anxiety, sensory overload, and difficulty with social interaction, all common after long-term solitary confinement. California Correctional Health Care Services, 2017. Prisoner rights groups continued to monitor conditions. In 2018, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed motions to enforce parts of the Ashker settlement, alleging that some prisoners were still being held in conditions amounting to solitary under new classifications. State legislators also introduced bills to codify time limits on restrictive housing statewide. At the same time, Correctio, ENS officials emphasized ongoing training for staff and the use of step-down programming to manage security risks. By the early 2020s, Pelican Bay's SHU population was a fraction of its former size. Nationally, other states cited California's experience when rolling back long-term isolation policies. Yet debates about solitary confinement continued, over its use for disciplinary segregation, mental health prisoners, and administrative placements outside of the old gang validation system. Advocates argue that transparency, data reporting, and independent oversight are necessary to ensure that reforms are not reversed. The story of Pelican Bay's SHU shows how a system built for permanent isolation can be forced to change when those inside speak out and the public pays attention. In 2011, few people outside Crescent City had ever heard of the Security Housing Unit. By 2015, hunger strikes, lawsuits, and media coverage had made it a national symbol of solitary confinement. The settlement in Ashker versus Governor of California ended indefinite SHU terms based solely on gang validation and cut the population dramatically, but it also opened a larger conversation about what humane incarceration should look like. Today, former SHU prisoners, family members, lawyers, and corrections officials all point to Pelican Bay as a turning point. Whether that legacy becomes a blueprint for lasting reform or a brief interruption in a cycle of isolation depends on continued vigilance. For the men who once lived for decades in concrete boxes, the struggle for dignity is not just history, it is still unfolding.